Someone tried to, went careering to the left like mad, stopped just in time, just short of the rubber. Death trap. I looked across the all but deserted field. Bertie was already clambering into the cockpit of the second Hurricane. I never discovered the saga of that one, or if I did, I've long since forgotten it. But it very much looked as if Bertie had found what he was hoping for. If we were going to try the two-in-one idea, with one sitting on the other's lap, I'd have to hurry. I made up my mind. "I'm going to try in this," I told the ground staff. "You'll kill yourself," a sergeant said succinctly. I climbed up and into the cockpit. Bertie, from across the airfield, put his thumb up in relief, and I saw his propeller start to turn. The die was cast now that he'd reassured himself I didn't need help from him. To be the last of 258 pilots left behind on an empty aerodrome was an unimaginable possibility. I checked the one vital gauge. The tank was full. I nodded to the sergeant, who shrugged and ordered the aircraft started. Probably he didn't mind too much. When it had gone or crashed, there'd be nothing left to keep him here. The engine coughed and started. The turning propeller became a misty circle tipped with colour at its rim. I held up a thumb, and the chocks were hauled away. Bertie was already taxiing across to the south end of the airfield. I taxied after him, or at least started to. But the sound below was awesome, the sensation horrible, like driving a car with the back wheels missing and everything scraping on the road. And there was a frightful yawing to the left. The men came ambling over, and the sergeant shouted something I couldn't hear. "What did I tell you?" I imagine. I shouted down and signalled for them to turn me round at a diagonal to the take-off run, helping them with rudder and a touch of throttle, then waved them away and said goodbye. There was a lot going for being a pilot. I saw Bertie begin his take-off run, disappear past me, then come into sight again already unstuck, with his undercarriage going up. I felt envious. I checked everything, let down the flaps a shade to give added lift, kept the brakes on and opened up the throttle as wide as I dared without tipping the Hurricane on its nose, then let go of the brakes and slammed the throttle open. At once, the Hurricane lurched away, yawing horribly, with a frightful rending sound in an arc to port yet gaining speed. The jungle horizon began turning clockwise at a sickening rate, and there was a juddering vibration in the whole machine. Then suddenly that was gone as I unstuck, but the jungle had disappeared as well, and in its place ahead of me was a black wooden hut I hadn't even noticed before, almost on the perimeter. It wasn't a very big hut, but it was big enough to hit, and I was sure I was going to. But I hauled back on the stick and scraped over somehow, cleared the surrounding jungle, and tore off after Bertie. We got to Kemajoran safely, beat it up and landed. I kept the tail up as long as I dared, and the speed down as low as possible, and landed on the right side of the runway. It wasn't too bad. I slewed off, but without any damage. Whatever the trouble was, it couldn't have been too bad, because the next day I was able to ferry the same machine to nearby Chilitan for operational duties. Pip Healy, whom we'd given up for lost in Singapore, was in a cinema and heard us land. He was at Kemajoran before we quit it. Meanwhile, the balance of 258 squadron pilots, that is to say, those who had not escaped from P2, either by Hurricane or by making their way southwards, in other words, those in Palembang itself, moved fast. They commandeered a launch, filled it with provisions, arms and spare cans of petrol, and set off upriver on the Moesi ahead of the invasion barges. Then in turn made their way down to Oosthaven on the southern tip, and crossed by boat to Java. The party included McNamara and Red Campbell, who, bless him, made the time to go through the sergeant's quarters collecting all the personal items he considered they might think particularly valuable, including logbooks. I got mine back in Java. At the end of this account, I have explained that, apart from the exceptions noted, it has been written from recollection with no attempt to seek material from surviving 258 squadron pilots. But after the draft was done, I happened, through my search for photographs, to hear from Arthur Sheerin, who escaped to his home country, Australia, where he went on to help form No. 77 Kitty Hawk Squadron before being posted to a senior flying training school as an instructor on Wirraways for 15 months. Then, finally, with the rank of flight lieutenant, acting squadron leader, to test and ferry flying. As a matter of fact, having apparently forgotten we have summertime, he telephoned me at 5 o'clock one morning, delighted to hear, after 35 years, that I was in the land of the living, as was I about him, and followed this by sending me a batch of photographs used in this book, and an account of his experiences from the time when he got away from P2. I found his letter so delightful as to want to quote from it verbatim. For the sake of chronology, I have split the quoted passages into 2 parts, which follow each other without break, the first of which follows now, and the balance later. I have learned from this letter several things, that Artie, or Artie as he calls himself, was probably in the first 16 who took off from Indomitable because he was flying in Singapore. It was he who, with the help of some engineers, pulled Roy Keedwell from his burning Hurricane. He was also flying on that vexing occasion before we strafed the paratroops, when we lost sight of P2 because of cloud. Whether he strafed or whether his was one of the 2 hurricanes which ended on their noses, I do not know. Let me know if you need any further adjustments. You will recall we were getting desperate for aircraft, and 6 of us were flown in a Dutch Lodestar to Batavia for replacements at a very low level. We picked them up, and led by Hutch, we flew back to P1 over cloud all the way. Hutch got lost and decided to descend and have a look. You can imagine our surprise when he lobbed us right in the middle of a formation of Zeros and bombers dropping paratroops. One word was said. God, go like bloody hell, as we had no ammo nor fuel. There was a surge of hurricanes headed for the trees. I thought I was good at low flying, but some guy passed underneath me going in the opposite direction. Another chap, I think Scotty, landed at P1 and was waved off by one of our chaps with curtains off the terminal. It was a record turnaround. Some made it to P2, but I think 3 of us crashed. At least I did. I was hightailing it through the trees with nil fuel on the gauge when 3 Zeros pounced on me. Having slipped them, the engine stopped, and it was then the jungle or the river. I think Mousy took the latter, and according to the manual on ditching, the flaps should have come off on impact. Well, they didn't. I did 3 beautiful takeoffs, and on the final landing I sank like a stone. After drinking half the river, I surfaced, got into the dinghy, and made the bank. I found a native fire going but no bods. After a while, they did emerge. I told them in some stupid lingo that I wanted to get to the big town or village fast, as by this time the place was full of paratroops. They, in turn, took me to another village that had a boat. We set off down the river for Palembang. After some time, out of the vines on the bank came a speedboat with Dutch naval blokes, all taking a bead on me with their guns, thinking I was a Japanese paratrooper. Standing up and shouting, I tipped our boat over and was picked up by the Dutch. They took me back to the bank whence they had come. I was surprised to see hidden under the bushes quite a large ship, which was stuck due to the Japanese having taken Palembang city. Further surprise, the captain took me to his mess for a scotch, and there was, I think, Red Campbell, who had also been shot down. The Dutch then agreed to take us as near to Palembang as safely possible. When we got there it was chaos, panic, everyone trying to get away. I crossed the river on a punt, and having spotted a staff car with a very frightened LAC driver at the wheel, I asked him what he was waiting for. His reply, "My commanding officer." My reply, "You stupid bee, let's get out of here." And I jumped in. We then drove to P2. You will know what happened there, no doubt. As to my escape from P2, you were correct. I remember Scotty and someone else setting off on foot. I went back to the aerodrome and some chap asked me if I could fly a Blenheim as he pointed to one and said it was full of chaps awaiting a driver. At that stage I would have flown anything, so I said yes. On my way to the aircraft, I noticed hidden in the bushes a Hurricane minus a tail wheel. That's for me. So I started up, popping and smoking, and commenced to taxi on the rudder. A fit light-duty pilot jumped on the wing and shouted, "That's mine! I hid it there!" "One thing to do," says Artie, "blow him off," which I did. As I commenced my take-off run, Japanese were at the end of the drome firing at me. I lost no time heading very low for Batavia with my popping Hurricane and a map on a cigarette case to navigate by. Later, I landed safely. The philosophy of the Dutch colonial was quite different from that of his British counterpart. While the British might envision retirement in green fields and sleepy hamlets, to a Dutchman, home was where he spent his working life, usually never to return. Dutch possessions were designed as communities rather than mere administrative centres. Even Palembang, a mere oil town cut from swampy jungle, had considerable quality. Batavia was a paradise, a garden city of fine hotels, outstanding restaurants, nightclubs, air-conditioned shops, broad streets, flowers, bustle, noise and colour. We were rich, millionaires. No. 258 squadron ground staff had arrived by ship on February 14th, but upon evacuation of Sumatra they were sensibly shipped off to India. In contrast, the ground staff of No. 605 Squadron, more experienced, remained. The imprest fund intended for hundreds of men was now available for just a dozen pilots, who might soon be dead or prisoners. In Java, we frequented the best hotels and tailors, living like kings. At the Capitool restaurant, we ate mixed grills, massive meals of steaks, pork chops, cutlets and more. We drank light Dutch beer and relished every moment. The Dutch around us, though they surely found us loud and brash, were friendly, likely because we wore pilots' brevets and were fighting the Japanese. The Dutch in Java accepted that the Japanese would soon invade. Few made efforts to escape, believing the Japanese would leave them in peace if they weren't troublesome. This strange pact seemed to have already been made between the businessmen dining at the Capitool and the Japanese assembling their invasion fleet. After the leisurely 2-hour dinner in the Capitool, we would normally head for the Black Cat, a nightclub of remarkable quality. It had one of the largest bars and one of the best and largest dance bands I had ever encountered in such a place. In London, the Regent Palace Hotel in Piccadilly was the recognised meeting place for pilots on leave. In Batavia, the Black Cat had a similar role. First arrivals would reserve several tables by sitting thinly at a couple and laying revolvers in holsters, which we were required to always wear, on others. By the time the evening was well underway, we would be packing several tables, and others would be piled with armaments. We ordered incredible rounds of highballs, and sooner or later the whole squadron, or what was left of it, would rise somewhat tipsily to its feet and regale the other customers with the 258 Squadron song, complete with actions. The song was called To You, Sweetheart, Aloha. To you, sweetheart, aloha. Aloha from the bottom of my heart. Keep that smile on your lips. Wipe that tear from your eyes. One more aloha, and it's time for goodbyes. To you, sweetheart, aloha. In dreams I'll be with you, dear, tonight, and I'll pray for that day when we two shall meet again. Until then, sweetheart, aloha. The actions, of course, fitted the words, and were carried out with the perfect timing from much practice in every bar and pub in England, where 258 Squadron had gathered and started drinking. On the whole, I don't think the rest of the people in these establishments minded. Such goings-on were part of the wartime scene. Nowadays, you'd get thrown out. The song was, obviously, of New Zealand origin. It's a sad thought to reflect on how few of the original New Zealanders who used to sing it survived the war. Apart from drinking and singing squadron songs, one was interested in women, and if one was fortunate, there were very beautiful girls to know in Java. I met such a one. Her name was Julie, and after the war I named my first car after her. She used to wear glittering sequined evening dresses with matching skull caps. She was a truly lovely creature with wonderful dark eyes, a husky voice, a superb and memorable body, and a sophistication beyond the wildest dreams of a boy of 21. She used to join me at the Black Cat after finishing her voluntary work at the Holland Huis, where I had met her. Even my CO would ask my permission to dance with her. We, the sergeant pilots, fell properly on our feet, having had a splendid private house made available to us. It was fully staffed and owned by a naval reservist who had been called up and got his wife and family away to another house he owned near Bandueng. We saw him just the once when he took us around, showed us where the drinks and cigars were kept, handed us the keys, wished us luck, and told us that if we needed to get away, he was hoping to escape in his yacht at the end and would have places for us. When the time came, we forgot all about him, but I don't suppose that mattered. If he hadn't already gotten away by then, he probably didn't anyway. We were issued a Bedford van, which we used to park on his front lawn and drive to Gillitan when on readiness. They were golden days, those last 2 weeks in Batavia. To have the contrast of exciting days and luxurious nights, to be young and have the stamina to manage both, to be rich, to have companionship of every kind, to be in a new and thrilling country, and to value every hour of every day. One cannot ask for more. Gillitan had 2 runways which met to form an L, and from any height, this gash, exposing blood-red earth in the green, fertile land, was an unfailing landmark to friend and foe alike. It lay perhaps 30 minutes from Batavia. 242 Squadron originally operated with 12 Hurricanes. 605 Squadron operated with 6 Hurricanes in 2 flights, each of 6 pilots, and adopted a system whereby one flight would fly from lunchtime on one day until lunchtime on the next, followed by 24 hours free. It was the best arrangement, giving the pilots 24 hours of intense excitement, followed by the blissful relief of a whole day released from duty. The American, Cardell Kleckner, Gillitan Airfield, left to right, Lambert, Dobbin, Author, Unknown, Sheerin, possibly Todt, Healy. There were 2 readiness huts, attractive thatched affairs with verandas where easy chairs were supplied for pilots on readiness. Inside each hut was a telephone for normal communication and combat instructions. The 605 readiness hut was just south of the east-west runway, close to where it met the north-south runway, and the 242 readiness hut was on the edge of the north-south runway, close to it. Behind the east-west runway, towards its western end, were modern buildings, now depressingly deserted, with their windows smashed and their lavatories choked with filth. I never remember seeing any Dutchmen, and no attempt was ever made to clean up these buildings or put the lavatories into a decent state. The whole thing was quite disgusting. From a flying point of view, things were far better than they had been in Sumatra. Apart from the operations room now running well, there were watchers to the north, on the myriad islands in the Sunda Straits, who reported the approach of enemy aircraft. Thus, for the first time, there was fair warning and the chance to climb high enough to engage the enemy, if not in equal numbers, at least otherwise on reasonable terms. The Japanese attacked daily in the same strength, which seemed to mark their general pattern, a bomber formation escorted by upwards of 40 Navy Zeros. The Hurricanes started flying at Gillitan from about February 18th, and despite being continually outnumbered, many times at the beginning and more disproportionately as aircraft were lost, they maintained a useful resistance until about March 3rd, and at least a presence from another airfield, Andir, until Java fell on March 8th. The reasons for this were twofold: growing experience in the pilots and reasonable warning. If anything proved the Maguire approach correct, it was Gillitan. Indeed, had the Maguire approach been followed, we would have had the remarkable experience of outnumbering the Japanese and being invariably in the most favourable combat situation. A force of what might well have been 100 fighters, operating from several airfields with a planned system of operations and working with a respectable bombing force, would have presented the Japanese, who were dealing with absurdly stretched communications, with problems they had not faced in Malaya, or, with the possible exception of the Philippines, in any other field. All the advantages would have been with the Hurricanes. One of the big problems facing the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain was that the Messerschmitts had to fly long distances to and back from the field of operations, and damaged aircraft could not be put down quickly on home-based airfields, nor could shot-down pilots be recovered. The same conditions would have applied to the Japanese, who could only have attacked from Palembang several hundred miles to the north, or from vulnerable aircraft carriers operating in an area subject to sudden and fierce tropical storms. Sumatra could have been a nasty thorn in the side of the Japanese, but Java might have held. It was the one possible base for operations on a grand scale, granted time to prepare. Fought for tenaciously, It had the size and terrain to absorb reverses. Its southern coast was never for long a Japanese sea. A spirited air of resistance, apparent to the native troops, who fought with varying degrees of courage, and to the Dutch, who never fought at all, except for their navy, might have helped build a different attitude. The key lay in the air. In the air, the Japanese fighters, though of a quality that surprised the Allies, were not machine for machine superior to the Hurricane when handled by pilots who had learned their craft against the Navy Zero. Much has been written to say the Japanese were superior, but much of this is apologia. Full data are available for those sufficiently interested to compare performance in many manuals written on the subject, which manuals, incidentally, confirm that the total number of Navy Zeros delivered by the outbreak of the Japanese War was only 400, and they did not possess the hordes erroneously assumed. The Navy Zero's advantages were that it was slightly faster at certain heights, up to about 20,000 feet, and it had a definite advantage in maneuverability. But it was unarmoured, its firepower was less, its ceiling was apparently lower. We never saw a Navy Zero operating above 30,000 feet, and above all, it lacked the astonishing capacity of the Hurricane to absorb punishment. Another favourable factor, mentioned earlier, was the very discipline of the Japanese Air Force, which enabled one, once the tactics were understood, to cope with it. Apart from the war at sea, the only real opposition to the Japanese invading Java came from the Hurricanes. It should have been the simplest matter, with such an advantage in numbers, to have kept continual small patrols of Navy Zeros over Gilliton, preventing us from landing. As far as I was concerned, not once did I meet enemy aircraft on returning to base, even though the field had been bombed and strafed while we were absent. Again, as Healy was to underline, captains of ships such as the Empire Star, on which he escaped from Singapore, soon learned that the risk of destruction under air attack was greatly reduced by the simple expedient of altering course only when the bomb doors were seen to open, knowing that all bombs would invariably be dropped together. Equally, the pilots of 232 and 258, and of 488, when they were finally given worthwhile tools after their hopeless buffaloes, learned, though too late to be of significance, how what had seemed insoluble was manageable. Had a substantial force of enemy bombers been attacked by a force of Hurricanes of sufficient size to detach a part equal in number to the defending fighters, and had those Hurricanes been flown by pilots with combat experience, acting to a well-thought-out plan with reliable intercommunication between air and ground and air to air, dreadful havoc could have been wrought. But such was not to be. Never once in Malaya, Singapore, Sumatra, Borneo, Celebes, Bali, Timor or Darwin did such a situation arise, but at least at Gilliton some of the drawbacks had been overcome. The initial losses of 258 Squadron, now A Flight of 605 Squadron, occurred on the second scramble. We had discussed tactics in great depth. Knowing we might often expect sufficient warning to be above the Japanese, we decided to adopt a dive and climb policy. We would fly up to maximum altitude, about 34,000 feet, await the arrival of the Japanese, and then dive down on them, firing one long burst en route. Whether successful or not, we would keep going straight down, knowing from the Palembang experience that the Navy Zeros, even if they could keep pace with us, wouldn't be able to stay with us because they would disintegrate on pull-out. We would then pull out and climb up again when well clear to repeat the exercise. These were not the most exciting tactics, but they were, we believed, the ones best calculated to maintain a fighter presence and, more importantly, to stay alive. We would not score many victories, perhaps, and we probably would not even know when we had scored victories, but at least we would be an infernal nuisance to the enemy. On the second scramble there were only 5 of us. The 6th Hurricane was presumably temporarily out of service. We climbed to our 30-odd thousand feet, and after a while, sure enough, the Japanese were below us, circling in 2 concentric rings, one several thousand feet below the other. There was Harry Dobbin, Red Campbell, Bertie Lambert, Vibert, and me. We peeled off to attack, Harry Dobbin, followed by one of the sergeants, then Campbell and the other 2. I selected my target and started firing at him from a long way off, staying with the one I picked as best I could by using aileron and rudder. It isn't as easy as it sounds. To start with, at 34,000 feet, a hurricane is wallowing in thin air, and there's not much precision either in the beginning or during the dive. Of course, the Japanese sees you coming and takes evasive action. On the other hand, a tropical sun is pretty vertical, making it difficult to look into. At all events, I got close enough to believe I saw pieces falling off this particular fellow before having to break away to avoid collision, the greatest danger in this kind of attack, and go straight down. Then, when well clear, I pulled out and climbed up again to have another go. I've subsequently heard from Vibert that he was not flying that day. Probably Pip Healy was the fifth. F.O. Harry Dobbin shot down and killed flying from Gillerton. This was what we were all supposed to be doing, and it was what Lambert and Vibert did. It wasn't what Campbell did, and we never found out whether it was what Dobby did because he was shot down and killed. It wasn't, of course, in Campbell's nature to stay with these kinds of tactics, and his story afterwards was approximately this. I got one on my first attack and was manoeuvring for another when I got hit. I went into a dive, but when I tried to pull out, the controls were dead. When I tried to slide back the hood, I couldn't. Probably a bullet or cannon shell had bent the runners. By now, I was moving too damn fast, and if I didn't get out soon, I never would. So I undid my straps and butted the hood with my head. On the third butt, I got out, hood and all. I was about to pull the ripcord when I thought, what the hell's the hurry, and decided to look around. The first thing I saw was my machine falling past me, and the next was my gun falling beside me, with the damn thing just out of reach. I tried like hell to edge over to it, but I couldn't, and anyway, it sped up pretty quickly and was way ahead of me. Then I remembered reading that in Free Flight there isn't much you can't do, so I tried a few swallow dives and jackknives, and that was great. But I stopped when I saw another kite going down and crash, pulled my cord and came down okay. I've never thought the story to be inaccurate, and the facts confirmed it. We never saw Harry Dobbin again, and Campbell, obviously lucky not to have broken his neck, was not to fly again. Most of us had stiff necks from constantly turning our heads to scan the sky. If you didn't do that, you didn't last very long, and Campbell couldn't turn his at all. So rather rapidly, we were down to 4 pilots, all sergeants. We discussed who should be what and decided to appoint Bertie Lambert commanding officer and me as acting commanding officer. I don't know if any other group of pilots ever had a sergeant commanding officer. In any case, if we'd been accurate, I suppose we ought to have titled ourselves flight commander and acting flight commander, but it was a nice conceit. Anyway, we were to all intents and purposes a separate flying unit. For the only time we saw the other half of the squadron was when one of us relieved the other. Vibert flew number 2 to Bertie, and Pip Healy as number 2 to me. And that was that. We were to go on flying until, by accident, strafing, casualties, or unserviceableness, the available aircraft were so reduced in numbers that the balance of 605s were given to 242, and in a flight at least, there were to be no more casualties. They became busy days. The telephone beside us rang unnervingly and ceaselessly. If you weren't smoking when it rang, the moment you knew it wasn't to tell you to scramble, you lit a cigarette. Probably you were smoking. We used to buy round tins of 50 players, and one didn't last a day. There was a system for that telephone. 1 ring was for us, 2 for the other squadron, and 3 for both. 1 or 2 rings could be, and often were, for unimportant reasons. 3 rings meant scramble anyway. We were on edge for the telephone ringing, yet always startled when it did. We'd stop talking, our hearts would begin to thud, and we'd grip the chairs like mad. If there was no second ring, Bertie would answer, and maybe we'd be off, or maybe not. If there was a second ring, we'd relax, if only momentarily. On the third ring, we'd pitch our cigarettes away and run like hell for the hurricanes. The duty ground staff, warned by a ghastly hooter, would be alerted by the time we got to them, the mechanics already up into the cockpits, the others standing by the parachutes to help us into them. They were always left resting on the port mainplane with their straps dangling, and what you did was to turn and offer your backs to them. As the shoulder straps were passed to you, You clicked their metal-banded ends into slots in the quick release, which was a circular bit of metal about level with your navel, and grabbed the other two between your legs, clicking them home as well. Then, clumsy as a waddling duck and puffed from running out and too much smoking, you'd climb up into the cockpit. The mechanics would have already started up the engines so that the aerodrome, moments before quiet, would be harsh with the snarl, but quietening as you throttled back. The mechanics who had stepped from the cockpit onto the wing route to help you up would place the harness over your shoulders while you reached for the lower straps. This was a webbing harness, each strap of which had a line of brass-bound holes that fitted over a boss into which you slid a split pin. This allowed a pilot to strap himself in as tightly as he chose, but release himself instantly in an emergency by drawing out the pin. All this would be done in great haste, as would be the fumbling with helmet, silk undergloves and gauntlets, the shoving of oxygen and RT tubes dangling from one's helmet into appropriate sockets, and the beginning of vital take-off checks, while already your instructions would be coming through. Scramble, EVIT aircraft! Scramble, EVIT aircraft! Preoc Angels 25, 40-plus bandits approaching from the northwest. We would wait for Bertie to start taxiing out across the bumpy grass and follow him. Vibert, then me, then Healy. Our hoods would be open, slid back in their runners, the bellow of the engines raucous in our ears, the smell of hot oil and petrol in our nostrils, and our hearts pounding in our chests. It was always the same, a hollowness in the stomach and a mingled sense of haste, excitement and trepidation. Bertie would slew dangerously fast onto the runway, check his drift, slam his throttle open, and be off with a tremendous full-throated, soon-waning roar. After him would go Vibert. This was Sergeant Pilot John Vibert, the New Zealander who volunteered to stay behind and fly with 258 and ended up a POW. No takeoff in formation. This was getting into the air as quickly as you could. Vibert would be moving down the runway before Bertie was unstuck, with us two following. With the aircraft not 5 feet off the ground, Bertie's undercarriage would be going up, and he'd be banking while he climbed towards the port of Tanjong Priok, and we would climb after him, Vibert tucking himself in just to his left and a little behind, while I'd be a little farther away on his right, with Pip Healy forming up on me. We'd already be craning our stiff necks for a sight of Japanese in any quadrant of the sky. The RT would be jabbering at us. "EVIT aircraft! EVIT aircraft! Are you receiving me?" Tanjong Priok was the port of Batavia, and a frequent target for Japanese bombing attacks. You could see Bertie's hand move as he flicked the switch and hear his Middlesbrough voice. "OK, Ryder. EVIT leader calling. Receiving you loud and clear. Red and yellow sections airborne. Are you receiving me?" Back it would come. EVIT leader, receiving you loud and clear. There are 27 bombers reported with about 30 fighters covering. Bombers at 18,000 feet. "Thank you for nothing, Ryder," Bertie would say, listening out. Bertie would look at me and then at Vibert, querying if we'd heard, and we'd thumb up at him that we had. We would be climbing hard at full throttle, only the cutout boost held back in reserve, and the angle of flight would allow us only to see each other and the sky above. Our ears would be filled with the roar of engine sound and rushing slipstream, and it would become cool, then cold. At about 12,000 feet, we'd shut our hoods, and with them most of the noise outside. Now each of us was cocooned in a little perspex world, the bars of the hood, its framework, forming a pattern against the sky, the oddly shaped, back-sloping windscreen broken by the gun sight. Already we would have turned the brass-milled wheel to fire, always a moment of drama when the roughness of the mill is felt even through layers of gloves. At 15,000 feet we'd turn on oxygen, and all the time we'd be grinning at each other, the trepidation quite gone, sharing a unique experience. 4 young men 3 miles up, heading for 7 miles up, made one entity by the indescribable camaraderie of the empty sky. We'd test our intercom. "Hello, Red 2. Red Leader calling. Are you receiving me? Over." "Hello, Red Leader. Red 2 calling. Receiving you loud and clear. Talk about SFA." We had our own codes now. 10/10 cloud we called Pilot's Delight, No cloud at all was sweet fuck all. PD and SFA. At 20,000, we'd be more watchful still, turning our heads all the time, this way, that way, upwards, downwards, sideways, scanning the sky. The most important thing of all. At 30,000, it was the same, but the formation was more open now as our controls grew sloppier in the thinner air. The last few thousand feet would be a painful crawl, with the knowledge that at 34,000 feet we'd be fireproof, perhaps even at 32. So far as we knew, apart from reconnaissance machines, there were no Japanese aircraft which could reach such a height, certainly not a Navy Naught. Yes, at 34,000 feet you were fireproof. You could just cruise, watching and waiting, taking your time. Manuals I have read more recently give maximum ceiling altitudes for the Navy Zero above 34,000 feet, but I find this difficult to believe. One thing which was quite certain was that we never saw them at such heights, and when they saw us above them at such heights, the Navy Zero pilots never tried to come up to meet us. Perhaps they were carrying heavier fuel loads than the aircraft on which the data was based, or the tropical air had some effect. We certainly worked on the assumption that hurricanes had superior ceilings and weren't to be disappointed. When we saw the enemy, it was always pretty much the same. The bombers at the lowest level, a screen of fighters above protecting them, and a second screen higher still protecting the first. We didn't follow any set order of attack. We were really, I suppose, rather like 4 high-level divers, each with his own board, deciding to make his dive when the fancy took him. I have no idea how much we achieved. Not a great deal, obviously. You have to be lucky to score victories with these kinds of tactics against an alert, maneuverable enemy. The important thing was to be there at all, to maintain a fighter presence. If there was any purpose at all in flying in Java, it was by being a nuisance to divert forces from elsewhere, so long as whenever the bombers arrived over Java there were fighters who might attack them. So long were the Japanese obliged to send quite large fighter screens in support. That we had some success is unquestionable because occasionally the wreck of a shot-down Navy Naught would be reported, but whether or not it was 605 or 242 S-A flights or B flights, Berties, Viberts, Heelys or mine, no one can say. We didn't make claims. We'd have looked foolish in front of the others doing so. Anyway, there wasn't anyone to make claims to. Just the 4 of us sitting in that hut when we were flying and roaring round Batavia when we weren't. One personal incident I had may explain both why there was so little time to judge the result of an attack, and how it was that we managed to stay intact. It was a day of towering cumulus, and our attack was made on a circle of Navy O's orbiting within a chasm between 2 such cloud formations. I happened to be the first to peel off, and having passed through the Japanese, I steepened almost to the vertical, engine full bore, and looked back on the off chance of seeing if I'd had any luck, and I saw one of the most beautiful things I ever saw flying. Following me down were the other 3, and after them was peeling the whole formation of Navy Naughts. Every aircraft was sharp and clear against the background of white cumulus. It was like a film set, but gigantic in scale, the actors minuscule but giving life to it. 20, 30 aircraft all in a screaming vertical power dive against a pure white background, with the green and red of the land hurtling upwards and the blue above. It was quite unforgettable. I watched it far too long. By the time I looked away, I must have dived vertically at full throttle for 7,000 or 8,000 feet, and when I tried to start easing out, I found there was nothing I could do. The controls were frozen solid. I throttled back, and putting my other hand on the control column, heaved on it with all my strength, thrusting with my feet, and it was to absolutely no effect. I was travelling too fast, and the controls were locked. There wasn't time to feel afraid. There never is in such circumstances. And you don't get blood leaking from the corner of your mouth, or any of that nonsense the filmmakers are so keen on. You just understand very clearly the predicament you're in, and that if you don't find a way out of it quickly, you will soon be dead. The whole of your past life doesn't flash in front of you, and you don't have visions of that dreadful moment of impact. You're much too busy. It was obvious that bailing out wasn't any good. At the sort of speed I'd by now reached, probably terminal velocity, if I'd even managed to get my head out of the cockpit, it would have been torn off, and even if it wasn't, the tail fin would probably just about slice me in two. So that wasn't on, and if I couldn't do anything with the stick, there was only one thing left: the tail trim. In a hurricane, there were minute strips of metal like tiny elevators on the trailing edges of the elevators themselves, which were adjustable by turning a relatively large wheel inside the cockpit. Like the smallest weights on a balance, these strips could be moved fractionally to give perfect fore and aft balance, so that in normal flight the stick is absolutely neutral. Indeed, that is their purpose. One was always instructed to treat tail trim with great respect, and it was often said that misuse at high speeds could tear off the tailplane. Now, to use it was Hobson's choice. I took one hand off the stick and wound the trim wheel the merest fraction towards myself, and at once grabbing at the stick again, I hauled on it with all my strength. And I was rewarded by the faintest softness, the slightest yielding. Hanging on like grim death with one hand, thrusting with my feet, my back pressed hard against the shield of armour plate behind me, I clung to my gain and wound the trim the merest fraction more and again grabbed at the stick and heaved. And I knew I was going to be all right, that I had left the vertical. I still had to be very careful. Too much exuberance would pull the hurricane apart. But I was winning. The G in my head was intense, and the aircraft, normally so light, felt like a lorry load of lead, and I could almost feel the huge strain on the wings myself. But I was winning. I began to see the red and green world below, which had been fixed, begin to slide away behind me as the nose came up, all the time accelerating until at length there was the horizon, and I was flying straight and level. I reversed the trim, busy talking to myself, as I found I always did under these kinds of circumstances. I looked at the altimeter, 15,000 feet, quite a long dive. I looked at the airspeed indicator and couldn't believe my eyes. 300-odd miles an hour. The first thing that crossed my mind was that if that was all I was doing, I'd soon have that shower of Navy O's on my tail. Anyway, how could I be only doing 300-odd miles an hour after what must have been a dive at terminal velocity? Glaring at the altimeter, I saw that the speed was dropping fast. As it should, I told myself aloud, throttled right back as I was. And it was then, of course, that the penny dropped. I'd gone right round the clock not once, but twice. I watched it absolutely fascinated, seeing it complete a counter-revolution, pass through 400 miles an hour at 1 o'clock on the inner scale, and then through 240 miles an hour at 5 o'clock on the outer one. It should, I thought, be all right now. I pushed the throttle open experimentally, and after a moment or two, the airspeed began to pick up again. There is a rule of thumb for converting true flying speed from the speed indicated by the instruments, which, working on air pressure, underwrite your speed the higher you climb. You add for every 1,000 feet of height 1 3/4% to the indicated speed. Even by the time I was flying straight and level, I had been flying at more than 590 miles an hour. The vertical speed must have been knocking the speed of sound. It is a remarkable achievement for the designer of an aircraft with a top straight and level speed of about 330 miles an hour that it could be put to such a test and emerge triumphant. It seemed that much more remarkable when compared with the disintegration of its rival at Palembang. There was no doubt about it, I thought, as I flew along, looking affectionately at the sturdy wings with their rows of rivets. As Arthur Sheerin had once said to me, "She's a sweet, bloody, marvellous, wonderful kite." I don't remember all that clearly those last few days of flying apart from incidents such as the above. We got strafed and bombed once or twice. I remember being in a slit trench with an air vice-marshal and a cannon shell lodging in the wall above his head, missing it by a few inches, and how he wanted to fly one of our Hurricanes for old time's sake, and we gave him permission on the agreement that if there was a flap, he'd fly 2 to Bertie. What a line! I remember when I had an air vice-marshal as my number 2. I remember Pip Healy roaring across the airfield at 0 feet, chasing a Navy O. I remember we got interviewed by someone or other who was making a broadcast home. He gave us a slap-up dinner at the Hotel des Indes in the Molenvliet, and I think that perhaps after all it was he who had the yacht at Tangiers Priok not our host with the open cellar. He took a note of our names and where we lived. I don't suppose he made the broadcast. The sands were running out too fast. I remember getting very drunk, all of us getting very drunk, hiring 4 bicycle rickshaws, putting the drivers in the passenger seats, and having a furious race round Batavia. I remember Julie. And I remember the last day we flew, March 1st, 1942. An hour before dawn, the telephone awakened us at our house, ordering us to Gilliton. We snatched a last cup of coffee and drove to the airfield in the Bedford, where we were informed that the Japanese had landed on Java at 3 points, one directly opposite the Sunda Straits, where they had apparently penetrated no less than 60 kilometres before being reported, another near Cheribon, some 60 miles or so east of Batavia, where they were still landing, and a third near Surabaya, about 400 miles further east. We were ordered to attack the landings at Cheribon, 242 Squadron having already done so, and lost 1 pilot in the process. We made 3 flights, one a particularly memorable one. This was the second sortie, and there were 5 Hurricanes flown by Wright, a Sergeant Young of 242 Squadron, Bertie, Pip and me. We flew, I remember, over land in an open V, finding the sky clear of cloud apart from a mass of cumulus near the coast. Approaching the landing zone, we were diverted by the sight of a single Japanese seaplane, presumably on patrol to protect the invasion fleet, although to give it such a name was, to say the very least, a slight exaggeration. We fell into line astern, with Wright commencing the attack, while I was ruefully reflecting that it was just my luck to be 5th in line with such a sitting target. I was mistaken. The Japanese pilot proved himself resourceful, capable, and daring. He immediately dropped his bomb load or depth charges, which exploded in the clear shallow sea, creating a fascinating coral atoll pattern. Instead of making for the cloud or diving for the sea, either of which manoeuvres would have been suicidal, he maintained his height, banked astonishingly steeply, and with our engines throttled right back to give the maximum time for the supposed en route destruction of this cumbersome machine, was suddenly not the pursued but the pursuer. Round and round the 6 of us went in a mad tight circle, with the gunner in the seaplane blazing away at me, and as I broke, Pip Healy and so on, forcing each in turn to take evasive action. Now we were thoroughly disorganised, and more than that, from a personal point of view, I appeared to have sprung some minor oil leak because my windscreen partially clouded over. On reflection, I suppose the proper thing for Wright to have done was to have detailed a couple of Hurricanes to deal with the seaplane, leaving the rest of us to carry on to the landing zone. Perhaps radio communication had broken down again. I don't know. I just know that there were no instructions, and it became a free-for-all. I saw Wright, an experienced pilot with 12 victories to his credit and the Distinguished Flying Medal, attack and fail. I saw Bertie attack and fail. I turned away to give myself distance and came in for my own attack, and the seaplane, grey camouflaged, all but disappeared against the dirty windscreen. I had to bank for fear of ramming it, and as I did so another Hurricane came whistling past me, far too close for comfort. And so it went on. What ought to have been a disciplined attack became a shambles, with Hurricanes more likely to shoot each other down or collide than be successful. The problem was the astonishing manoeuvrability of the seaplane, which seemed to have the ability to turn as tightly as a tiger moth. It was here, there, and everywhere, with 5 fighters buzzing around it, coming in on a random attack only to break away as they saw another coming in to attack as well. Not that this is new. There have been many occasions where markedly less manoeuvrable aircraft have escaped in similar circumstances. After a while, there was an unspoken agreement to hold back and let Wright take the fellow on alone. We watched, frustrated. He made attack after attack, but the will-o'-the-wisp avoided each one until finally, out of ammunition, he set off back to Gilliton to rearm, with Bertie and Pip following him. It was better now. There were just the 2 of us, and no danger really of collision. We both attacked singly, and in the end Young shot it down. With plenty of petrol and ammunition left, I couldn't see any reason for going back to Gilliton, so I set off for the invasion zone. The fleet consisted of a mere 4 transports and 3 destroyers, and troops were coming ashore in all manner of small craft, from sampans upwards, and none very large. They were difficult to attack effectively, and it was all rather different from on the Moesi. There, almost every bullet counted. Here, the vast majority sprayed an empty sea. Still, there were a lot of targets, and one could manage more than one at a time on a run. There were targets ashore as well, an established gun emplacement which gave its position away by firing at me and being right out in the open, surprisingly unprotected and easily silenced, and a couple more seaplanes rather cleverly drawn up in small palm-girt coves, of which I managed to set one on fire, and whose destruction was confirmed later in the prison camp. It was an altogether exciting and memorable few minutes with no Navy O's about, and the only opposition the flak from the destroyers. They managed to get my height, but not my range. It's very difficult to hit a low-flying aircraft travelling at several hundred miles an hour, and I could see the shrapnel kicking up small puffs of sand below me, and the shells bursting nearby, looking exactly like sea urchins. But the picture I remember most clearly, in fact, I'm not at all sure it isn't out of the whole war the picture I remember best of all, is of the first Japanese I saw really close. I only saw him for a split second, but the image is fixed like a photograph by the click of a camera shutter. He was wearing dark green shorts and a yellow shirt. He had no cap on, and he was kneeling in the surf on an unprotected sandy beach, looking over his shoulder at me as I came inland about 20 feet after a strafing run. He looked absolutely terrified. Of the flying part of 258 experiences, there is little more to say, and nothing which wouldn't be repetition. We refueled and rearmed, made one more sortie, and then, on landing, handed our machines over to the other flight that had come to relieve us and went off, thankfully, for lunch in Batavia. Although we didn't know it, we had made our last wartime flights. In this account, I have not attempted to catalogue results, and have only mentioned those which were part of incidents such as that of the seaplane on March 1st, in which the story would have been incomplete without such mention. I couldn't give more than an incomplete list of victories known and claimed, and to include these would be invidious to other pilots. In fact, I would very much doubt there were any 258 pilots who flew long enough who didn't have their share of certain victories, their probables and their possibles. Few were not involved in the Moesi strafing in Singapore, or in strafing on the Java landings. I think it fair to leave it like that. Of the 22 pilots who had left Abbotssinch, by the time Java fell, 5 had been confirmed killed. 1 was missing, 1 was interned, to escape and be killed later. 2 were injured, both to be killed later. 5 were prisoners, and only 8, of which 3 were to be killed later, were still available for flying. It is fair to ask whether these losses were worthwhile, and I suppose the answer varies according to points of view. We certainly did kill a lot of Japanese and shot down a fair number of their aircraft. On the other hand, it is doubtful if we held up the invasions of Sumatra and Java, or their capitulations, by as much as a single day. It could well have been another story, if only Mickey Maguire had had his way. We lunched well and went back to our house to a message from Victor de la Perelle, one of the squadron pilots who, having been put in charge of administration, had scarcely flown. A likeable man, Perelle had a face badly scarred from a German cannon shell that had disintegrated inside his cockpit when he was shooting up a flagship in June of 1941, and a sad man too. Roy Keedwell had become his closest friend. The message was that the 4 remaining Hurricanes of 605 were to be handed over to 242, and all other pilots would be leaving for the southern port of Gilliat Japanese for embarkation, following the other 258 pilots who had already left from the same port a few hours earlier. The decision had followed a letter written 4 days earlier by Air Commodore Vincent to the Air Officer commanding West Group RAF Base Headquarters, Batavia. February 25, 1942. We are getting very short of fighter defence in this forward sector. This afternoon we are actually down to 6 serviceable aircraft between the 2 squadrons. All being well, we shall get back to a total of 10 or 11 tomorrow. We are not likely ever to better that figure owing to daily casualties, and the force is definitely wasting. The Dutch are, I am told, not using the Hurricanes that we gave them operationally, and they have also removed all their fighters from Chisauk, so that our meagre force is all there is in the front line. F/Lot Victor de la Perelle. Is it possible for us to get the Hurricanes back, or at least persuade the Dutch to bring them perhaps to Semplak or Chisauk to share out some of the very strenuous flying and fighting that our squadrons are doing? If we cannot get any more aircraft, I think the time has come to shrink to one squadron, and I would suggest, if this is done, that 605 should go, though the airmen are quite among the very best as workers and fighters, and 242 should stay, as they have more pilots. They should take on the few pilots from 605 also. At the moment, Chisauk is our reserve aerodrome. I am moving the R&R party from Gilunga tomorrow morning, as it is so much better. I went yesterday to Chisauk to ask the Dutch commandant to carry out any R&R work necessary, but found the Dutch had flown. We have no other reserve aerodrome except Chisomang, which is near Bandueng, and I have not been able to visit that. My Dutch liaison officer, whom I asked to get particulars, measurements, communications, etc., has absconded, with a personal debt of 20 guilders to me, so I am not in the picture, I am afraid, there. I want to go into the question of an alternative operations room further back, in case our present one is blitzed, perhaps in Buitenzorg or even Bandueng. I would like to have your views on this first, however, on the advisability of the Labour wiring S. Lajok Thompson on SS Ko Geda evacuating Java. I have now spoken to you on the telephone on the first part of this letter, but I would like it on paper also. Yours, Vincent. Second thoughts were to carry the day and were, unfortunately, too late to consider it wiser to send the by now experienced 605 pilots to a new theatre of operations rather than add them to a squadron which already had far more than enough pilots for its few machines. The 226 group records read, Ambrose Milnes on Kota Gede. On the 27th February, Air Vice Marshal Maltby AOC Murer, so renamed from West Group, visited Batavia. He was very favourably impressed by the efficiency of the operations room and the excellent morale and spirit of the fighter pilots and ground personnel, and instructed Air Commodore Vincent to leave the country next day together with as many of his staff as possible. He thought that the group might reform in Ceylon. Air Vice Marshal Maltby had stated on the 22nd of February 42 that on March 3rd, 42, a decision would be taken regarding fighter aircraft reinforcement of Java or elsewhere, on Kota Gede. On the afternoon of the 28th, Air Commodore Vincent, with Nichols, Milnes, and 7 members of his staff, proceeded to Bandueng, where they were instructed by Air Vice Marshal Maltby to carry on through the night to Chilatjap, where they boarded the SS Zandam, which was alleged to be proceeding to Colombo. The ship was diverted to Fremantle, where it arrived on the 6th of March. The 2 squadrons were left in the charge of Wing Commander Maguire, but owing to wastage, 1 squadron only, number 242, was operated, and the pilots of 605 Squadron under Squadron Leader Wright were sent off to evacuate if possible. It is hoped that these personnel may be in Ceylon or India. If not, they are presumed to be prisoners of war. We left, in fact, late on the afternoon of March 1st in our Bedford van with Bertie Lambert driving. After almost falling into Japanese hands by taking a wrong turning, we caught up with a large convoy heading south towards Bandueng. There was much rumour and little real information, and the rest of us sat in the back with rifles and Tommy guns we had managed to lay our hands on at the ready. But the road was hilly and tortuous, and lorries ahead of us in the convoy continually broke down, obliging us to pick up stragglers. Soon we were so packed that we could hardly have used these arms in an emergency. All in all, it was a dramatic enough night, with the thought of escape sharpening apprehension of the possibility of ambush, and with the thrill and novelty of the first night any of us had known journeying through a beautiful tropical land. The roads were packed, not simply by our convoy moving southwards, but by Dutch and Indonesian troops heading northwards, begging for information which no one could give. There was no sense of panic, but there was huge confusion and uncertainty. We arrived at Bandueng at 8 in the morning of March 2nd, expecting to refuel and pass straight through to Cilatjap. Had we done so, we would have avoided being taken prisoner. But it was not to be. For no reason that made any sense to us, or which was ever discovered, we were ordered to remain, and 2 precious days slipped by in idleness, while news, or at any rate rumour, grew more and more disquieting. Shipping at Gilat Japanese was, we were told, being heavily attacked, and most ships leaving port were promptly sunk by Japanese submarines. It was probably nonsense. What was not nonsense were the daily formations of Japanese bombers attacking the nearby airfield of Andir, to which 242 had withdrawn with the last remaining hurricanes. We were quartered in the military barracks of Timahi, fretting with impatience as each passing hour diminished the possibility of escape on, for example, longer-range aircraft quitting Andir for Australia. We lived in great style, but this was the only consolation, and the town was permeated with the same depressing atmosphere of defeatism we had first experienced at P2 on the way up to Singapore. Everywhere the Japanese advanced, almost unresisted. There were no suggestions as to how they might be halted, nor knowledge of anyone opposing them. It seemed absurd. Through strafing one of the invading forces, being among the very few of the military milling around ever to have fired a shot in anger, we felt entitled to be angry. Although we were only 2 days in Bandueng, with each hour so precious it seemed like many more. On March 4th, belated instructions were given that all pilots must be evacuated, and we were supplied with 2 Ford V8S with orders that, at all costs, Gilat Japanese must be made by midnight, or the ship we were to board would have already sailed. We left at dusk, our iron rations, crates of champagne, and bully beef. There were 10 of us. In one car, Campbell, de la Perelle, Lambert, Healy, and myself. Wright, Vibert, and 3 others in the second. That drive was thrilling and quite unforgettable. The night was glorious, as bright as day, the road all but deserted, the route through fantastic scenery, hills and valleys, forests, jungle, rice fields, and rivers and lakes silver in the brilliant moonlight. Swarms of fireflies lit our way, and the jungles were shrieking with tree frogs and cicadas. As on the road to Bandueng we lost our way, driving for perhaps 20 miles in a false direction, and were stopped at a roadblock manned by Indonesians, a mile, we were told, from the Japanese. We turned and drove more furiously than ever, taking turns at the wheel, consulting our watches, doing arithmetic, opening bottle after bottle of champagne, and throwing the empties through the windows. We shrieked through dark and silent kampongs, talked incessantly, and bellowed aloha at the night. We knew that midnight wasn't possible. Gilat Japanese was too far. But we didn't believe we would be taken prisoner. We were too young and optimistic. We didn't believe fate would cheat us at the very end. If necessary, we told ourselves, the boat would wait. Anyway, when did a boat ever sail on time? It was 2 o'clock when we arrived on the outskirts of the town, which was forebodingly still, and, apart from the insect sounds, quite silent. We had no idea of the direction of the docks, and there was no one about to tell us. We could see no signs, and the moon had set. We paused, one car, the other left behind, and were deep in a council of war when we saw an armed man approaching. He was Oriental, and we assumed Indonesian. As best we could, with barely a word of Malay between us, we asked him to direct us to the docks. He did so, and at once melted into the blackness. We took the road suggested, and with every yard it grew gloomier and gloomier, the trees closing in, narrowing to a dusty cart track at its end. With each passing moment, imagination took strength, and we began to ask ourselves, and then each other, if our guide hadn't been Javanese but Japanese. We stopped the cars, dismounted, revolvers in our hands, prepared for an ambush. But there was nothing, no ambush and no docks, just the empty, silent, threatening night. We were fevered by impatience and frustration, imagining even at that moment our ship weighing anchor, leaving us behind. And then another man approached. He was a Dutch officer. He was quite to the point. There were no ships. The last ship had been sunk by dive bombers the previous day. It wouldn't have made any difference even if we had arrived by midnight. I suppose that was something of a consolation, but not a very great one. We were deflated. It was a dreadful anticlimax. And although we wouldn't admit it, we realized the last hope had gone. There, on a hot tropical night, in a dusty, gloomy lane in a tawdry little dockyard town on the south coast of Java. We found a hotel, its owner bemused by circumstances, his last guest gone. He shrugged his shoulders and left us to our own devices. We drank his champagne, used his kitchen, and slept fitfully in armchairs in the lounge. There were presumably ample beds available. We never thought of using them. In the morning we were bombed. The hotel was located in the centre of a complex of gun emplacements. The first bombing was by heavy bombers that made their run directly over us. When they had finished, we went outside. At once we heard the sound of approaching aircraft, but these weren't heavy bombers. Bertie looked up. "Hurricanes!" he shouted. "5 in a Vic and 1 in the box!" But then we saw the bombs begin to fall. We threw ourselves to the ground, and after the bombs had exploded, ran back into the hotel and, for want of a better place, dove under the billiard table. There were succeeding waves, and the hotel was struck. The noise was appalling and to a pattern, the hum of approaching engines, the increasing roar as the dive bombers came in for their attack, the by now familiar kudumph, kudumph, kudumph of Bofors guns, machine gun fire, the whistling of bombs, the thud of explosions all around and very near, the waning sound of aircraft overtaken by a new formation beginning it all again. Soon, all around us was a welter of debris. The windows were all blown in, and glass was everywhere. Part of the roof collapsed, burying the billiard table with bricks, laths, tiles, and plaster, and everywhere was thick dust. Just across the road, a house was blazing. It seemed obvious the hotel was a death trap. In a lull between one raid and the next, we raced for the cover of a ditch across the road. All around were fires, and from the nearby railway yard, ammunition trains were burning and exploding with the most tremendous concussion. Dead were lying in the street. As the next formation began its dive, we raced across the road and flung ourselves into the ditch, a drain in fact, and in it, crouching low, was Wright. As we got our heads down, we heard the guns begin to fire and the whistling of bombs. It lasted for about an hour, a very personal attack. When it was over, we went back into the hotel, which had, after all, miraculously escaped complete destruction. But the lounge was an awesome sight, and here and there, where we had put them down, were glasses of champagne. Each wore a thick white layer of plaster dust, like cream. We spent that day and night at Cilatjap, trying to formulate a plan. We knew nothing of the country, we had no Malay, and we could obtain no reliable information. The town lay under a pall of smoke from a writhing cauliflower reddened by internal flames, which was all that remained of an ammunition dump. We watched with envious eyes a Catalina flying boat daring to reconnoitre, and discussed crackpot schemes of inching our way by sampan along all the islands, Java, Bali, Sumba, Sumbawa, Timor to Darwin. We drank champagne and smoked endless cigarettes. There was no point in staying at Cilatjap, and after that gruelling morning of March 5th, the Japanese didn't bother to bomb it. There was nothing left worthwhile to bomb. On the morning of the 6th, we set off in the direction of Yogyakarta, where we had been told we might catch a boat. By the time we arrived at Purworejo, we realized that Yogyakarta was inland. As we drove into Purworejo, the troops in it were moving out, advising us that the Japanese were expected imminently, although where they could have come from I can't imagine. We provisioned and turned eastwards. There were only 2 possibilities unless we tried the sampan venture, which reflection told us would be slow suicide even if we found the sampan, to take to the bush or be taken prisoner. Taking to the bush would have been much like taking to a sampan, except that even had we managed to survive, it would have been only a matter of time before the Javanese betrayed us to the Japanese, as indeed they did to a small group by then, ridden with amoebic dysentery, who joined us subsequently in our prison camp. And if we were to be taken prisoner, the wise thing was to be part of a large group, not a small band to be summarily slaughtered because of their nuisance value. So we drove eastwards, not back through Cilatjap, but inland, picking up the Bandueng Road again and spending the night at a small town named Chiamis, sleeping on straw palliasses in a barn, washing in rank well water, eating native food. Chaos was everywhere. There were convoys passing in opposite directions, each with its own differing information, its own barely formulated plans. Japanese aircraft were continually overhead, strafing the roads and bombing nearby objectives. Rumour was rife, rumour and counter-rumour, and despair was intermingled with hope. There was no way of halting the Japanese, yet it was impossible to conceive that such a vast country, with its teeming millions, could be overrun by such a small number of enemies. A stand would be made somewhere. On the 7th, we drove eastwards, camouflaging the V8S with banana tree fronds at every halt and diving into muddy ditches when the road was strafed. At Tasik Malaya, we met our Defence Office pilot officer Taut going the other way. We didn't discuss the Japanese raid on P1 with paratroops. P1 was nearly 600 miles away and 1,000 years in time. But we talked about something else. He told us that 232 Squadron had flown until their last Hurricane had been destroyed, and then 2 Lockheed Lodestars were detailed to fly them to Australia. Their commanding officer, Squadron Leader Brooker, and several other pilots had already left in the first, and the rest were in the second, about to leave when they were ordered out by a Dutch officer and his entourage at the point of Tommy guns. The Dutch went instead. Was it truth or fable? It could have been true. With our experience of the Dutch in Java, we believed it was. The next day was March 8th. Still heading eastwards, we were overtaken by a contingent of native troops in a truck from which fluttered a huge Japanese flag. The troops did not seem in the least depressed. It was, they told us, all over. Java had capitulated. After 8 days, the most modest force of Japanese had, practically without opposition, invested the enormous island and secured its vast resources. Now the decision, toyed with previously, had to be made. Did we take to the jungle, untrained, without radio equipment, without the language, in a country whose natives were already sensing liberation from their Dutch masters, armed only with revolvers and a few rounds of ammunition? Or did we accept what the men in the endless convoys passing and repassing had accepted? That it was over. That it was up to other men. We finally decided against the jungle, and the squadron documents were destroyed. We were still not quite without hope that some miracle would happen. It was possible that all the bad news was rumour. No one we met, or indeed were to meet in the next 2 weeks, had met or would in that time see, except in the air, a single Japanese. That was quite remarkable. For the next 2 weeks, thousands upon thousands of British troops, admittedly mostly non-combatant, Air Force ground staff, Army ordnance, cooks, pay clerks, signallers, the tail of military units, largely unarmed, devoid of a real leader, would wander without the least let or hindrance through vast tracts of Java, while their conquerors must have wondered who these men were who had ruled the largest empire the world had ever known. We overtook a major convoy and fell in with it, heading south and spending the night encamped at a large tea plantation known as Neglisari, a delightful spot high up in the hills, from which a tantalizing triangle of sea could just be seen. Our quarters were a tanning shed, our ablutions done in an ice-cold mountain stream. In the morning we were addressed by Air Vice Marshal Maltby to the effect that our fighting days were over. We rebelled, and leaving the huge convoy, headed further south towards the sea, spending the night sleeping as best we could in the V8S. The next morning we came upon the ground staff of 605 Squadron. They had searched the coast a mere 10 or 15 miles distant. There were no boats, except for the hills. There was nowhere to go. The empty sea lay to the south, and to the north, at Garowe, were the Japanese, a vital town where there was a railway terminus and which lay on the road from Bandueng to Chilat Japanese and the whole of southern Java. We conferred and decided to throw in our lot with 605. We dubbed our new Camp Happy Valley. And it was indeed as near to Shangri-La as anything imaginable. There were high hills all around, and a torrential river conveniently broadened itself into a deep, safe swimming pool. It was often wet, but always warm. The scenery was superb. The rich land of Java yielded ample supplies, eggs, chicken, fruit and vegetables to relieve the monotony of tinned supplies. We tried buffalo and found it sweet but palatable. We chewed brown bars of molasses shaped like seaside rock. Quite soon, a sense of peace fell over Happy Valley, illogical but mesmerizing, bringing with it feelings of permanence. Native huts, vermin-ridden, papered with old newspapers, were commandeered and cleaned, and we began to talk of planting vegetables and studying for examinations. No aircraft bothered us. There could well have been no enemy nearer than Japan itself. Out of initial chaos, discipline began to reassert itself and rank to count. The beginnings of a structure formed. Daily routine orders were issued and fatigues arranged. Suddenly there was no war anymore, merely a large group of Britishers who had taken possession of a corner of a foreign land and were settling into it as in a province. This lasted for a week when orders were received from the Dutch command to move northwards past Neglasari to another tea plantation at Palemport. The roads looked different now, being littered with the accoutrements of a defeated army which had destroyed all it could. Wrecked cars, lorries lying smashed in ditches, spiked Bofors guns, and burnt-out Bren gun carriers were everywhere. It seemed astonishing that with so much equipment to destroy, it hadn't been possible to hold the Japanese. The scenery was magnificent, with the road, rarely level, winding its way through mountainsides and into valleys of paddy field and jungle. The plantation at Palemport was the biggest yet and the best equipped. There was a football pitch, tennis courts, and a swimming pool. Again we settled in. Again the sense of permanence developed. There were new huts to rid of spiders, lizards, fleas, and rats, with more newspapers brittle and brown with age to strip from the walls, more chicken, buffalo steaks, and gula, as the molasses was called, to buy, more vegetables to plant. An attitude, astounding now to contemplate, that the Japanese would leave the camp to its own devices providing they were not provoked, took hold. Day followed day, leisurely and pleasant, with nothing to do but laze, swim, talk, smoke, eat, and watch football matches played against the local Javanese. Perhaps it was as well. After the jagged weeks, we needed rest for what was to lie ahead. Then came the first instructions from the conquerors. Their prisoners were to march to Batavia, some 200 miles away, and be there in 6 days. The Japanese would, they said, take care of stragglers. Then these instructions were countermanded and new ones issued. The prisoners, using their own transport, would move north to Garouet. I never discovered how it came about that I should accompany a much-tattooed First World War veteran, squadron leader Wigram, to act as advance liaison with the Japanese. We drove, just the two of us, in a private car on March 20th, and were quite unmolested, meeting the first Japanese on the outskirts of the town. Apart from the one who had looked up at me from the beach at Cheribon, this was the first I had seen at close quarters. He was a sentry on guard duty, and he had his back very definitely to a wall, his rifle gripped very firmly indeed, and his eyes flickering in every direction as if he suspected that at any moment someone might shoot him. It was altogether a very curious business, and we had the sense that the Japanese, arranging with us where their new batch of prisoners were to be billeted, having first to ascertain how many they would be, were equally nonplussed by the situation. The prisoners already in the town outnumbered their captors several times and had taken over much of its administration, with military police on point duty controlling traffic, and others, like ourselves, commandeering accommodation, organising food supplies, or simply wandering around shopping and sightseeing. The few Japanese who held Garouet, on the other hand, were mystified and ill at ease. They looked very small and puny in comparison with their captives, and their uniforms oddly comical. It was hard to take them seriously. Later in the day, the main force of prisoners drove in a convoy which, for all the Japanese knew, could well have been bristling with hidden arms, increasing the disproportion of captured to captor. One had the sense that it only needed someone to suggest the town should be taken from the Japanese, and it could have been accomplished in short order. Yet, when absurdity seemed to have been stretched to breaking point, this was to be shown to be far from so for the Japanese. puzzled as to some means by which their captives should occupy their time, either suggested or accepted the suggestion of daily route marches out into the country. Over the next 3 days, there was the remarkable spectacle of large bodies of prisoners stepping it out 3 abreast, singing their dirty marching songs, quite unaccompanied by guards, leaving their captors miles behind, but dutifully returning to them in time for tea. I found it difficult to rid myself of the feeling that some extraordinary mistake had happened. These Japanese. Where were the brutes who had, they said, manacled men's wrists with rusty nuts and bolts, shot helpless men to death in the ditches of Sumatra, used prisoners for bayonet practice? Not these men, surely. Not these nervous, shabby little dwarves who stood blinking at us myopically as we marched by them, lustily singing our bawdy songs and keeping splendid step. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right way, L. Oh, the eagles, they fly high in Mobile. Oh, the eagles, they fly high in Mobile. Oh, the eagles, they fly high, and they shit right in your eye. It's a good thing cows don't fly in Mobile. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left. I was haunted by the same curious feeling which must have overtaken the troops meeting in No Man's Land on that first Christmas Day of 1914. That this could only be a mistake. Because where was the animosity? The threat? Perhaps, I wondered, the British and the Japanese had secretly made it up. Perhaps there were negotiations going on and orders had been given out to those in the know on either side to keep a low profile until the I's had been crossed and the I's dotted. That would have made sense of it, as far as I could see the only thing that would. But the dream came to its appointed end. On the night of March 23rd, we were instructed to march to a railway station near Garowe, some miles away. It was a cool night with the way lighted by small encampments of British Army units by the roadside. It was not unpleasant, marching along in the magic of the night, singing. Better than on the daily marches in the awful heat, and probably a worthwhile thing to do because it would be better back in Batavia with its facilities, worth the long and, by the end, rather weary drag. The train pulled out at 6 a.m. There was plenty of room, and the Japanese presented each prisoner with 2 packets of cigarettes, and the run was fascinating. In the late afternoon we drew into the outskirts of Batavia, and Dutch girls lined the track and waved to us as if we were the conquerors rather than the conquered. It happened that as we pulled into the station, I was standing behind Squadron Leader Wygram. He was obviously determined to put a good face on things, to show he didn't give a fig for the Japanese, that he at least didn't intend to truckle to them. He deliberately sat on the carriage step so that his legs were dangling casually as we pulled in. Illusions abruptly died. A Japanese officer, his face suffused with rage, ran up and, as the train came to a stop, was savagely beating the old man about his legs with his cane and slapping him about the face. We were marched through the streets with indecent haste, like cows being herded off to market. There would have been a dignity in it if we'd been allowed to march in step. We turned a corner and came in sight of a sombre, shabby-looking set of buildings approached by an unmade dusty road, and girt by high lime-whited walls with higher-roofed corner turrets from which armed Japanese stared down at us. The red ball on white of the Nippon flag fluttered mockingly. "God!" I heard someone shout. "It's a bloody prison!" There was a crude and shabby portico of concrete leading to a set of iron doors with barred openings above. The 2 centre doors were open. We were bundled through past a tallyman. Every 6th prisoner was booted, and at each booting the tallyman made a mark. Inside was a large open courtyard made by an inner wall which the turrets straddled, and directly ahead of us a huge cage with sides made of bars which men were clutching. We passed the cage, and doors were opened on a line of cells, and 150 were counted off and allocated, crowded into a fearful room with a concrete floor and tiny barred windows high up in the walls. Heavy doors were slammed, locked and barred upon us. We had arrived, in the native jail of Bois Glodok. But at least we were still together, Bertie Lambert, Pip Healy and myself, the last 3 pilots of the old 258 to fly. It would be foolhardy to claim there are no inaccuracies in this account. 35 years is a long time. and memory fades. There were a few notes, photographs, and a logbook I managed to keep hidden from the Japanese through many searches, and I have, by studying official records, managed to remove a number of crashing blunders from an original draft. But accepting the quotations from these records, on the whole what is contained in these pages is drawn from personal recollection, and must by necessity have errors. I make no apology on account of this, for this is no attempt to write an official history, but merely to tell the story of a short but exciting period in the life of a fighter squadron, as seen largely through the eyes of one of its junior pilots. For the same reasons, I have made no attempt to bring the contents linguistically up to date. I have called a Navy 0, a Navy 0, and sometimes a Navy 0, because they were not called Zeeks or Zeros then, and I have spelled the names of towns as I would have spelled them at the time. I have expressed views which may well not have stood up to the test of history, but these were the views I and my friends held at the time, and what happened to these men and what they felt is what these pages are all about. There is no claim made, nor intended, that 258 Squadron shone in bravery, ability, or success, nor that it had a lion's share of the action. On the contrary, 232 Squadron would have had a longer and certainly more successful tale to tell, while other squadrons, such as 488, played at least equal parts. But it is of 258 I write, where, however, I must apologize, is for any errors, exaggerations, oversights, or the like which cause pain. If I have transposed the actions of 2 pilots, I apologize. If I have improperly slighted by omission, I apologize. If I have unjustifiably indicated any lack of courage or resolution to any individual or groups of men, I apologize. But, saving these possibilities, all that I have written is so far as I have been able to set it down as accurate as memory, supported only by the research indicated above, allows. Only recently I read a first-class account of naval operations in this theatre of war. There was an immense bibliography. No less than 87 books were noted in it. The author was entitled to be believed. For a while I was tempted, but in the end I ran away from it. My heart quailed at the thought of the books I would have to read, the libraries I would have to visit, the letters throughout the world I would have to write. But there was an even more important consideration. Of the 258 squadron pilots who left Abbotssinch on that bleak November morning in 1941, about half survived the war. I could, before I set about this book, have been in touch with every one of them, and if any of them chance upon it, they may perhaps wonder why I did not. The answer is that memories which I have carried for so long have become old friends, and if I had upset them now, they would have been very doubtful allies in an attempt to set down something as it seemed to be, 35 years back in time.